Good afternoon. Welcome and thanks to all of you for joining us today. We have over 160 industry participants that have registered for today's webinar. My name is Rob Cook and I'm the Executive Director of Ontario Racing, and we're here today to share some information about the proposed long-term funding framework for horse racing in Ontario. During the course of the in-person consultations that we conducted last fall, we heard from industry participants that they needed more information about what was being proposed. In response to those requests, and as part of our commitment to providing the industry with more transparency, we have worked with OLG and the Woodbine Entertainment Group to release the legal document that underpins this funding proposal. This document is on the Ontario Racing website and currently available publicly. The document is called a Letter of Intent, or LOI. It's a non-binding document which outlines the details that were shared with you during the first phase of industry consultations. Ontario Racing has recently released a preliminary consultation report on Phase 1 consultations, and we want to hear more from industry participants as part of the Phase 2. Sharing the LOI is part of our efforts to ensure that the industry is better informed, and it's now my pleasure to indicate we have legal counsel from both OLG and WEG with us to take us through the LOI document. I'd like to introduce Bill Ford from the Woodbine Entertainment Group and Laurie Sullivan from OLG. They will walk you through the terms of the original LOI completed in September of 2016, and I should note it does not reflect any comments or feedback that we heard during the recent industry consultation. So this is the original document. At the close of the presentation, we've allocated some time for questions. This presentation and the questions and answer session will be focused on the contents of the LOI only. Written questions submitted to OR outside this webinar will be answered in writing. So if you have further questions that are not directly related to the LOI or that aren't able to be answered in today's session, please reach out to us directly and we'll work to answer those questions as soon as possible. So it's now my pleasure to turn the webinar over to Laurie and Bill.
Thank you, Rob. Good afternoon. Looking at the purpose of this webinar is to take participants through an overview of the purpose and key provisions of the non-binding letter of intent entered into between OLG, Woodbine Entertainment Group, and Ontario Racing Association in September of 2016. The LOI is a roadmap, a proposed roadmap for support of the horse racing industry, which is being reviewed by the industry through its representatives.
Great, thank you, Rob and Laurie. With respect to the LOI, I think as Rob mentioned earlier, it's important to keep in mind that it was executed in September 2016. I think it's very clear right in the first paragraph of the letter of intent that the document was intended to facilitate further discussions regarding the implementation of a funding model. The goal is to create certainty of funding upon which industry stakeholders can make rational business decisions and investments. If the arrangements are successful, then the goal would be to become less reliant on the government funding and to scale back over time. But the key term here is if we are successful. WEG thinks that success is possible. There have been some great strides made by the current Standardbred Alliance, and we can leverage these learnings and apply across the entire province going forward.
Now let's look at some key terms of the LOI, and actually we thought it would be beneficial to directly reference the LOI. So if you've seen the document, there's a preamble on pages 1 and 2, and there's a lot of words on the page, but essentially they boil down to stating that this is a non-binding letter of intent meant to lay out a foundation for a funding arrangement for the industry. And there are also quite a bit of language regarding approvals for this to come to fruition, and especially in regards to OLG. OLG requires a specific regulation under its own governing act to fund horse racing directly in the province.
Great. The LOI also sets out at a high level the parameters upon which the new alliance would be formed. We're going to take some of the key learnings that we learned under the Standardbred Alliance that we think have been successful and add a degree of formality and rigor to the new alliance that would be a step up and that Woodbine is supportive of. Members would be those racetracks that conduct live racing in the province and which want to be members of this alliance. The new alliance would be governed by a board of directors that is made up from a broad spectrum of racetracks across the province. All levels of racing would be offered the chance to participate, and all breeds would be offered the chance if they want to participate within the alliance. WEG would not have voting control over the alliance, but would have certain material items upon which it would require their approval. Examples of this would be the removal of Woodbine as a manager, removal of Woodbine as a member, items such as that. In addition, WEG would then in turn enter into a management agreement with the alliance. WEG would receive a management fee of $2 million a year to do that. Really, that $2 million is only a fraction of the true cost of managing the alliance.
Further terms of the LOI. On page 3, there's a discussion about the funding agreement. So there will be an agreement between the new racing alliance that Bill just described and OLG. It is to be effective no later than April 1st, 2021, the date that is anticipated that the horse racing funding program currently in place would expire. However, if there's alignment to commence earlier and approvals can be achieved, then an earlier commencement date could be affected. And if so, the LOI does provide that it will still run to 2038, as if the 17-year term started in 2021, despite the earlier commencement date. The term, total possible funding term of 17 years, which I just contradicted before, could be longer if the commencement date was earlier. But essentially, if it started in 2021, it would be a 17-year term, an initial term of 7 years plus 2 5-year extensions. And the extensions do relate back to an assessment of the Racing Alliance's operations and performance based on pre-identified performance measures. We move to page 4 and 5, you'll see that there's discussion of the annual payment. This is the funding level. It's a single source of funding to the Racetrack Alliance. The annual payment is set at $93.4 million in total, broken down by $91.4 million for the racetracks payment and $2 million for the administration payment for the cost and expenses of administering the new Racing Alliance. The Racetrack Alliance funding reflects the current level of the Horse Racing Partnership Funding Program funding.
As mentioned earlier, one of the goals of this funding model is to allow for the industry to grow from a secure platform. If successful in the growth, we think that it's only fair to reduce the burden on the province over time. One such measure of success will be the provincial handle numbers. Today, the Alliance has handle of approximately $850 million. Other tracks currently not in the Alliance have approximately anywhere from $30 to $40 million in handle. So you can see we're below $900 million. What is contemplated in the LOI is that in the event the provincial home market handle were to hit $1.2 billion, that there would be a corresponding reduction in the amount of funding coming from the OLG. As we all know, a dollar of handle does not mean a dollar of revenue for the racetracks, and the number that was agreed upon with the government was that it would be a reduction of 5% from the handle numbers above $1.2 billion. We believe that that number allows a fair bit of growth before we even need to worry about a reduction the funding from the OLG, and we would be hopeful that this is an achievable long-term goal.
Thank you, Bill. Some other areas where there could be a decrease in the funding provided by OLG, where there are replacement funds available. Gaming expansion rent at the Woodbine racing site. The racetrack's payment will be reduced by the amount of rent received by WAG for the expansion of gaming at the Woodbine site, and all such rent would be contributed to the Racing Alliance to replace OLG funding. Another area would be increased or additional gaming rent at the Mohawk racing site. There, the racetrack's payment will be reduced by the amount of increased rent received by WAG for the lease of gaming space at the Mohawk site, which is in excess of $15 million. However, WAG must contribute all of the increased rent to the Racing Alliance to replace OLG funding. Increased funding through gaming rent at other racetracks. Racetracks payment will be reduced by 50% of the amount of the increased rent received by a racetrack for the lease of gaming space. The racetrack is contemplated to contribute all of the increased rent, however, to the Racing Alliance to replace OLG funding. So in this case, in summary, the reduction to OLG's funding is not always 100% of the increased revenues through gaming. However, the contribution to the Racing Alliance is 100%.
The letter of intent also contains a number of key terms and conditions that I would say are fairly standard for a legal document of this type. There are a number of covenants put into the document. Covenants are really no more than promises. So I would say that there are significant covenants that are required to be done by the new Racing Alliance and by Woodbine. The Racing Alliance main key covenant is the creation of an annual business plan, which will have embedded within it a rolling 5-year strategic plan. The plan will include items like race dates, purse levels, schedules, etc. To understand the approval process for the annual business plan, the plan would first be created by Woodbine as the manager of the Alliance. It would then present that plan to the Alliance board. The board would then need to approve the plan. The plan would then go to the OR board, which is made up of a broader industry stakeholder group. From there, the business plan would go to the OLG as the funding partner for review and sign-off, and finally to the AGCO as the regulator for the industry. Obviously, there will need to be rigid timelines and planning to ensure that this plan gets approved on an annual basis. Also, to ensure that this review can happen in a thorough and meaningful manner, there are a number of reporting requirements that are set out in the covenants so that all industry participants and stakeholders can review the plan in a proper and thorough way. Finally, Woodbine as manager also has a number of specific covenants applicable to it. Again, these are mostly around running the race dates and ensuring that the purses are paid appropriately.
Some other parts of the LOI, there is a section on page 11 regarding performance measurement and KPIs. This states that there will be minimum service levels and key performance indicators that will be developed with the industry and be used by OLG, the Racing Alliance, and OR to assess the health of the industry and guide fact-based decision-making on funding and industry goals. And just as with the covenant section that Bill mentioned, there is a couple pages of termination rights. This lists the reasons that contract for funding could be terminated. We believe if you read through them, you will see that for a commercial agreement binding on OLG for funding, these termination events are quite customary for agreement of the size and nature of the proposed funding agreement. So we're not going to list each one of them here, but they are considered standard for an agreement of this nature.
Great. So what are the key next steps? You'll see in front of you on page 11 a kind of a next step diagram, and I would say the key is starting at first is that Ontario Racing must complete its industry consultations. As most of you are aware, the preliminary report is now out, and it is hoped that the second round of consultations will be completed by the end of the month, after which a final report will be put out. Following that final report, there will be a need to work on formally creating the new racing alliance. WEG will initiate the meetings of the tracks which are conducting live racing and which wish to participate. Some of the key legal steps that will need to be considered and done are formal incorporation, articles and bylaws, and then working to get a board in place. The next items, while kind of appearing to follow one after the other, I actually think would occur almost all at the same time and concurrently. You know, the Racing Alliance must then work on its key internal arrangements, including the Woodbine Management Agreement. Work must be started on that first annual business plan and work on the process for approval of that plan. And then finally, the OLG will be working on the funding arrangement and will be working with the Alliance and Woodbine to finalize the terms of that agreement. Once all of those things are in place, we would be in position to move forward. So I think that that is the end of our formal presentation at this point, and I turn it back over to Rob.
Thank you, Bill and Laurie. I have a couple of questions. They're starting to come in. The first question is there any consideration of cost of living increases in the funding?
This is Laurie. At this point in time, no. There is no increase to the funding with respect to an inflationary matter or cost of living factor. But I understand that that's been provided through consultation feedback, so that will be taken in for review and further consultation.
Thank you, Laurie. A second part of that question, is there any contemplation within the LOI of additional funding, increases to the funding?
Not at this time. The funding maximum level has been set and is split between the racetrack payment and the administration payment.
Thank you. Another question, why is there such urgency to create and sign off on an agreement instead of taking a more considered approach, given that the current funding ends in 2019 and may be extended until 2021?
Often, these matters can take some time to conclude, and we think we're being prudent in beginning the process with the industry, with some key members of the industry, and going through a lengthy consultation process with the assistance and support of Ontario Racing. And then we will take that back and do review and further consultation. And so this takes a lot of time to process through, and I believe we've been really responsible in starting this process early. And as I said in the presentation, should there be alignment to move to the new funding model at an earlier stage, then we would have the ability to do so and have already gone through all the consultations required to get there.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, I would just like to add that we think the importance of long-term certainty cannot be stressed enough. This is an industry, whether you own a racetrack or own a farm or are breeding horses, where you need to know what the long-term plan is. And while 2021 may seem a long ways off, it really is not a long ways off in terms of your planning for your business going forward. And that's why we think this 17 years of certainty is key for the industry moving forward.
Thank you. Another question, will funding be broken down by breed? How will the funding actually be allocated?
So based on what's in the LOI right now, the annual business plan, which would allocate funding at that particular detailed level, would be the decision of the Racing Alliance through the annual business plan, which would then be approved and then go through subsequent approvals that Bill had described. So the detail of that would actually be in the business plan created by and approved by the industry.
Thank you. The next question is, how is the $2 million fee for WEG to act as administrator of the Racetrack Alliance determined?
In the current program being administered under the TPAs, the $2 million annually was identified for administration costs, which were originally the responsibility of ORC, and then they were subsequently, those responsibilities were transferred to OLG. In the LOI, OLG has actually offered up that $2 million in administrative fee funding to the administration of the new Racing Alliance and its manager.
Thank you, Lori. So the question is, why is the Racetrack Alliance administration responsibility being given to WEG under the LOI and not being looked at as alternatives such as putting it out for RFP?
I would just briefly say, and Bill can respond as well, that we have seen great success with WEG administering the current Standardbred Alliance, and they are a significant presence in the Ontario horse racing sector.
Yes, so it's, without wanting to be self-serving, we actually think that we are uniquely situated to be the entity that can do this and do this successfully. We think we were able to show that we can do it with the Standardbred Alliance, and we would kind of take the learnings that we've been able to achieve there and put it across the whole provincial model. I would just say that we think the admin costs and the costs of managing are significantly higher than $2 million. We understand that $2 million is what is available, and we've agreed to do it for that, but we don't think another party would be able to do it nearly as well as us for that amount.
Thank you. Next question is, the letter of intent talks about the Racetrack Alliance having an agreement with only one horse-person group per breed. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so currently the requirement is to every betting permit that you are given by the CPMA, you must have an agreement with your local horsemen's group. So under the Standardbred Alliance today, the Woodbine Horsemen's Agreement that it has with COSA and the HBPA covers the wagering across the alliance, and we think that that is the appropriate model going forward. I would say we are very, very aware of the importance of the benefits to local horsemen and want to make it clear that benefits will be made available to horsemen at all tracks that are in the alliance, but we do think it appropriate from an administrative point of view that there would just be an agreement with a horsemen's group, one for each breed at this time.
Thanks, Bill. Next question is, can you clarify the additional expansion revenue at other racetracks? Does all additional revenue flow to the Alliance, and then the racetrack revenue get reduced by 50%?
Not quite, but that's a good question. The way it has worked in the current LOI, it was contemplated that additional revenue coming from rental payments for the lease of space for gaming would equal an increase in revenue indirectly or directly from the OLG. Only 50% of that amount would reduce OLG's funding under the funding agreement. But 100% of the additional amount would go back into the industry to support horse racing.
Thank you. I have another question, and this is a crystal ball question, so good luck. Can a future provincial government terminate the funding?
This has been set up as a commercial arrangement between the OLG and the Racetrack Alliance. Its ability to be terminated will be based on the terms of the funding agreement. We have outlined in the funding agreement, LOI, the progress for renewals and the rights of termination. And those will be predetermined and set out within the contract and will be binding on OLG.
Thank you. One more question. Will the industry have access to any paperwork or final documents before the actual funding agreement is approved at the end of the process?
We envision that that will be the case. And obviously the Racetrack Alliance will be seeing the full documentation, as it will have to be approved and executed by that alliance.
And we also anticipate that Ontario Racing and its board will be very involved in the entire process as well, and see the documentation as it moves forward as well.
Thank you. We're still getting some questions in. Next one, how will the new Racetrack Alliance board be selected?
At this time, what we would be looking for would be representation across the industry, different geographic zones, and different levels of racing. The key would be to ensure that there is a broad representation, but I think it would be selected amongst the members, and we would need to come to an agreement on what the appropriate board looks like, and then once the membership has been established, there would need to be a formal vote of the members to confirm the board that was put in place.
Yes, and vis-a-vis the content of the LOI, OLG has asked for representation for members across the breeds and the levels of racetrack.
So we'll entertain one last question. We're approaching 2:30. There aren't a lot of questions flowing in. Let me see. So questions around, are there any plans to allow for increased revenue to racing via products beyond the pari-mutuel framework? I guess the question is, what other sources of revenue might be available in the future beyond the LOI?
This is not addressed within the LOI, and if you'd prefer, we would answer that question outside of this forum, where we're focusing today on the content of the letter of intent, and we have been brought in to specifically address those questions.
Great answer. So we're probably at that point. There are other questions, but to Laurie's point, a lot of them are outside of really the specifics of the LOI that our distinguished guests can probably answer. We have all the questions. We would encourage people to continue to send in questions or comments. We will endeavor to answer all of the questions and feedback to the industry. So in closing, thank you everyone for participating. Just a reminder that this webinar is recorded, will be posted on the OR website and available to everyone. The letter of intent will stay posted as well into the immediate future. And with that, I would encourage all of you to engage in responding to the phase 2 part of the industry consultation as we move towards what will be a negotiating process to create this letter, this funding letter of intent, or agreement, I guess. So thank you again for attending, and have a great day.